North Korea is a state that for decades was surrounded by an almost absolute veil of silence. The Kim regime built one of the most sealed-off totalitarian systems in human history, and within that system, women occupy a position that is oddly at odds with official propaganda. On the one hand, the authorities proclaim the equality of all citizens before the great idea of Juche. On the other, the reality described by defectors and documented by human rights organizations reveals a deeply patriarchal world in which sex at birth determines one's life path almost as strongly as class belonging in the Songbun system. The official image of the North Korean woman was already shaped by Kim Il-sung, who after the end of the Japanese occupation in 1945 issued regulations formally guaranteeing women equal rights to work, education, and participation in public life. In the first years of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, women entered factories and fields en masse because the wartime destruction and labor shortages could not be repaired any other way. Propaganda proclaimed that the new socialist person is sexless in their obligations to the party and the leader, and that the woman working shoulder to shoulder with the man embodies precisely that ideal. In practice, marriage and motherhood never lost their character as state institutions in North Korea. Women were encouraged, and in certain periods even required, to bear children, because population growth was a tool for building labor force and military potential. From childhood, girls were raised to be exemplary daughters of the leader, who through their role in the family, the factory, and the local party cell attest to the correctness of the nation's socialist path. School, youth organizations, and omnipresent propaganda polished this image for years before a girl got married, which in the case of women usually happened several years earlier than for men, whose priorities were different. First of all, years of military service. Military service is one of the keys to understanding gender status in this country. Men are required to serve for up to 10 years, which means that during the most important period of personality and skill formation, they are absorbed by the army. Women could serve voluntarily under Kim Jong-un's regime, but compulsory military service for women was introduced in 1994 and covered a shorter period than for men, usually lasting from 5 to 7 years. Although propaganda portrays the female soldier as a heroine, returning from the army meant for most women an immediate entry into the role of wife and mother, while men left the army with a network of contacts and often with party appointments. The Songbun system, that is, the hereditary classification of citizens according to the loyalty of their ancestors to the regime, intersects with gender status in a way that weighs doubly on women from lower strata. Women from classes considered hostile or suspect encounter barriers to education and work that are unattainable even for men from the same backgrounds, because the former have fewer channels of social advancement. The army as a springboard to elevation is essentially available to men, and opportunities for study in prestigious fields are limited by both class and gender. Women from the highest strata, related to the party elite, enjoy a far more comfortable life. Yet even they are subject to strict control of behavior, clothing, and social contacts. The Great Famine, which claimed from 500,000 to 2 million lives in the 1990s, and which North Koreans call the Arduous March, proved to be a turning point not only demographically but also socially. When the state food distribution system collapsed, women took on almost the entire burden of keeping families alive. Men, formerly assigned to factories and workplaces, from which wages suddenly disappeared, could not leave their post without exposing themselves to sanctions. Women, treated by the system as economically subordinate beings and therefore not worthy of much attention from the control organs, gained the paradoxical freedom to trade in the then illegal markets, spontaneously organized by citizens frustrated by the lack of access to food. It was these informal markets, called Jangmadang, that became the basis of women's economic activity, which survived the famine and grew into a network of non-state trade, now covering a vast part of North Korea. Research based on defectors' testimonies indicates that at its peak, between 70 and 80% of active traders in these markets were women. They sold food, clothes, medicines, and over time, also entertainment content smuggled from China and from the South on flash drives and discs. This role brought women a certain degree of financial independence that had previously been unavailable to them, but it also exposed them to violence from security officers, extorting bribes, and to public humiliation when regular cleanup campaigns were carried out against the grey market. Labor camps, called Kwanliso or Kyohwaso, are places of particular degradation. Women are most often sent there in connection with an attempt to flee to China, with belonging to the Christian religion, which is considered a hostile faith, or because of family ties to people deemed enemies of the state. Inside the camps, the divisions between guards and female prisoners are total and unmistakable. The former have absolute power, the latter have no rights. Defectors' accounts describe routine punishments and the assignment of female prisoners to the most physically exhausting labor, such as coal mining or forestry work. Escape from North Korea is a path that was and is undertaken primarily by women. It is estimated that between 70 and 80% of all defectors who manage to reach South Korea are women. This is connected with several factors. First, men are more tightly controlled by the military and party apparatus, which makes it harder for them to leave their place of residence on their own. Second, women developed, during their commercial activity in the Jangmadang, a network of contacts and the ability to move within the gray zone, which is essential when organizing an escape through China. Third, many defectors seek work or shelter in China, and China does not recognize defectors as refugees. It forcibly sends them back to North Korea, where they face harsh imprisonment or execution. Women who do not have the means to pay a smuggler often fall into the hands of brokers, promising work in restaurants or factories. The fate of some is less dramatic. They live in a legal gray zone as unregistered wives of Chinese men, deprived of documents and of the ability to formally apply for asylum. Yet their dependence is absolute, and the threat of deportation hangs over them constantly. Aid organizations estimate that tens of thousands of North Korean women live in this limbo on Chinese territory. Those who manage to traverse the next stages of the route through Southeast Asia and reach South Korea encounter new barriers to integration. Seoul is for them at once a paradise of freedom and a labyrinth of foreignness. The Unification Ministry runs the Hanawon Integration Center, where defectors go through an adaptation program, learn to use ATMs and the internet, and are introduced to the rules of the capitalist labor market and democratic law. However, women who spent months or years in China before reaching the South often have to struggle with trauma from experiences of violence and living in hiding. Research by Korean psychologists indicates that rates of post-traumatic stress disorder among female defectors are higher than among men in the same group. Returning to the everyday life of those who remain in North Korea, the picture that emerges from collected testimonies and from careful analysis of available data is that of a woman living in constant tension between the expectations of family, the party, and her own need to survive. In the elite districts of Pyongyang, especially in the Ryomyong and Changjeon areas, women from party families live in conditions of material comfort that stand in sharp contrast to the realities of the provinces. They have access to well-stocked stores, clinics with real medical equipment, and the ability to send their children to better schools. Their social life is regulated by an unwritten code of conduct, applying at every level of the party hierarchy. And dress, hairstyle, and manner of speaking are subject to as strict a control as in the lowest strata, though overseen by the milieu rather than by street officers. In the provinces, this discipline takes a harsher form. Women are subject to regular clothing inspections, and wearing trousers by women was for many years forbidden or at least formally unacceptable, as incompatible with the traditional image of woman in Korean Confucian culture, which the regime selectively invoked whenever it suited political aims. At the end of the 1990s and in the first decade of this century, these bans were regularly renewed and enforced by bundang, local security committees, which could stop a woman in the street and punish her for a skirt that was too short, a clothing color that was too bright, or a hairstyle deemed a Western influence. These influences, arriving along with smuggled films and music from South Korea and the United States, are treated by the security apparatus as ideological weapons, and women, as those who most visibly express cultural belonging through dress and appearance, are on the front line of this peculiar defensive campaign. Kim Jong-un, who took power after his father's death in 2011, made certain external image adjustments. His wife, Ri Sol-ju, appeared publicly as a figure with a distinct identity, elegant, smiling, dressed in Western outfits, which in itself was a departure from tradition, since Kim Jong-il's wife was never shown. However, this change was purely propagandistic and did not bring about any systemic reforms in women's situation. On the contrary, in the early 20s of the 21st century, the regime passed a series of laws tightening regulations on content imported from abroad, which hit especially hard women active in the distribution network of illegal media. In North Korea, where the entire state apparatus is focused on preserving the power of the Kim dynasty, individual rights, and especially women's rights, are a suspension for which the system's ideological architecture leaves no room. Not because North Koreans are devoid of a sense of dignity or a freedom instinct, but because the system is designed to suppress every sign of individual agency, and especially female agency, before it turns into anything political. Leave a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell.